Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Common Life Safety and Physical Environment Challenges. My name is Maria Sigala, and on behalf of all of us here at Chartis Clinical Quality Solutions, thank you so much for joining us today. This is one of our monthly clinical webinars. This is a March topic, Common Life Safety and Physical Environment Challenges. And April topic is the Joint Commission's Model for New Requirements. Hope you all will be able to join. Before we begin, I'll walk through a few quick housekeeping instructions. This presentation is designed to be interactive, so please become part of the discussion by typing questions or comments into the Q&A box you see on your screen. Time permitting, we will also call on participants with raised hands, which is located on the reactions menu. Today's session is being recorded and will be available within a couple of days. The handout for today's presentation will be uploaded to the webinar's chat throughout the session for those who joined us late. You'll be able to access the recording and handouts by going to chartisquality.com, clicking on Insights, and going to our webinar page, then locating the Common Life Safety and Physical Environment Challenges webinar. Our past webinars are also available on our webinar page. If at any time you don't see the slides moving or you're having trouble with the audio, try refreshing your browser first. You can also submit any technical questions into the Q&A box. We're here to help you at any time. Thank you all so much for being here with us today. I'll now turn the floor over to Bud Pate, our VP for Content and Development, to begin the presentation.
Thank you, Maria, and thanks to everybody for attending today. I think this is going to be interesting. I always learn stuff from Lori and Steve, and so I'm looking forward to learning more today. So, just as a side note, like Maria said, all of these past webinars, including this one, are going to be available for streaming on our site. No cost. All you need to do is go to the site, and you'll see here that we've gotten everything from practical approaches to regulation surveys, EMTALA, protecting suicidal patients, as you know, that's highly cited, how to respond to state and accreditation findings, infection prevention, which is, we've all seen infection prevention catastrophe, so we talk a little bit about the direction to go there. A little bit of looking forward. This was a few months ago. We were looking forward into what's going on into 2023. Documentation simplification, better meetings, better results, and then the one today. And then there are future ones, so please come back to our website often and join us. We're, for those of you who don't know Chartis, we're the Greeley Company, really. We've been the Greeley Company for 20 years, but we were just delighted to become aligned with the Chartis group here in 2019. And to that end, we've changed our name to Chartis Clinical Quality Solutions. And it's not just environmental care, although we do environmental care. We'll talk about that. But we do high reliability medical staff services. We have education for physicians and others at a national level. We do interim staffing through Chartis Workforce Solutions. And of course, when it comes to compliance, we're into readiness, response, and reliability. So not just fixing something once, but keeping it fixed. And that really applies to any accreditor, the state agencies that are coming in, and of course, CMS. And you can see on the screen a broad range of things that we tackle. When it comes, though, to the physical environment with Lori and Steve and the rest of our folks at the Clinical Solutions, we do environmental care, mock surveys, and solutions, help people solving things. We look at, do a lot of work in ligature risk assessment and, of course, emergency management, emergency preparedness. And on the life safety side of things, we get real into detail with the drawings, updating drawings. The assessments can be as detailed as you like. They can be mock survey-like, but they can go into a lot of depth. And Lori is the lead of our life safety folks there. So we have world-class people. You're going to hear from the two of them right away. So Before we get going, though, we just want to learn a little bit about you. And so Maria is going to post a poll that you'll see on your screen. If you wouldn't mind asking that, what is your role? Are you part of the quality and patient safety department, environmental safety or regulatory compliance, facilities or engineering, plant services, infection prevention, environmental services, housekeeping, emergency management, meaning disaster management? Are you part of the leadership team at your institution, or is it something else? So if you wouldn't mind responding to that. And it looks like we're getting good responses. So let's publish that, Maria, so everybody can see it. So it looks like we've got a lot of people from quality and safety and regulatory compliance, environmental compliance. We surprisingly have just a few people from facilities and engineering, and we do have a few folks from upper management leadership. Well, welcome everybody. We're really delighted to have you on. Let me just introduce our speakers today. Steve MacArthur has been with the Greeley Company for eons, for forever, it seems, certainly longer than I have, and I've been with the Greeley Company 20 years. And Steve is an expert in environmental care, emergency management, a lot of the things that we'll be talking about today. And Lori Denny is a real in-depth specialist just on the life safety code aspect of that. And so you really learn a lot from them, and I'm going to get through my part of the presentation as quickly as I can so we can get to that content. Our focus, their focus always is to get things done, and getting things done, you need to make it, reduce the complexity as much as you can. And so that's what we'll be doing. One more question before we get into the meat of the presentation. Who is your primary accreditor? Is that the joint? So Maria, you can, yeah, thank you. She's publishing the poll. Thank you. Is it HFAP? Now it's called ACHC, DNV, GL, CIHQ, or is your hospital non-accredited, or do you have somebody else that would accredit you? So, all righty, we can go ahead and publish that poll. We've got a couple of people who are either non-accredited or accredited by somebody else. Most of our folks, over 3/4 of them, are accredited by Joint Commission, and a couple of DNV GLs. And we're getting to see a lot of DNV folks. That's a growing competitor to the Joint Commission. So thank you. You can stop sharing that. Thanks for sharing, everybody. Really appreciate that. So I think we're not going to go in depth in all of environmental care because we know that that's it, but we're going to try and prioritize and identify the real reasons that people are getting into serious trouble there. And there are folks who are getting into serious trouble. And we'll not only talk about what the issues are, but might give you some hints about where to go to resolve those. And as always, we like to say that, look, any solution you're doing, whether it's environmental care, suicide prevention, nursing, infection prevention, whatever it is, if you're trying to comply with something, you have to balance quality, safety, and efficiency. If it's just there because people want to do better, or if it's just there for safety purposes or quality or efficiency purposes, in other words, it's budget cutting, it's not going to last. And sometimes, there are some survey findings that don't even make sense. They don't contribute to safety. They don't contribute to quality. They don't contribute to efficiency. Those will not be sustainable if that's what you're. And so we encourage you to find the sweet spot on correcting these things that balance quality, safety, and efficiency. They have to be efficiency long term. So I know that's sort of a high concept, but we find it really important for sustainable solutions, which is where we are. So let's talk about where to focus, and then we'll get into the meat of these common findings and what to do about them, and some strategies for reaching that sweet spot. That's going to be something that we'll talk about towards the end. And as Maria was talking before, we will have a time for questions at the end. but let me just make sure I have this up. Yeah, as we go along, there's a Q&A on your screen. So if you type your question into there, I'll be listening in the background and we'll try and work those into the presentation as we go. So where to focus? You know, there are so many issues. When we look at a typical Joint Commission report, with a little bit more than CMS, but if we look at a Joint Commission report or DNVGL report, you see all of these environmental care issues because there's so many requirements and so many things in the life safety code, environmental care, those things that are related to the physical environment that fall into infection prevention. There's just tons of them, and no one that I know of has all of those things under control. So how do we think about what we really focus on and address first and make sure we have in mind? And so we like to think of it in terms of a couple of dimensions. Certainly, we want to look at things that are frequently cited, and then some things are less frequently cited. So clearly, we want to look at the more frequently cited usually than the less frequently cited, but we can't forget severity. And so we also want to say, what are the highly significant findings and those of lower significance? And we'll talk about how to make that decision so you can help focus. So as we go through the presentation, you're going to see that we're going to be labeling these as either quadrant 1, quadrant 2, quadrant 3, or quadrant 4, with quadrant 1 being frequently cited and highly significant. And then we get to the highly significant that are less frequent, but nevertheless, we have to guard against those ones that are going to get us into trouble. And then finally, we get into those lower significance findings that are nevertheless frequently cited. So you'll see this little grid on the slides as we go through as to where we think those issues find. But let me talk, so this is sort of a mock-up of what the grid looks like. So what do we mean by higher significance and lower significance? Well, we use the Joint Commission SAFER matrix to help us here, and that it doesn't really matter whether you're Joint Commission accredited or not. This is a good way to distinguish in your own mind what's going to get you into trouble and what isn't going to get you into trouble. And this is, I think this is 2019 data, but this hasn't changed that much. There are 10 different strata that the Joint Commission uses on their SAFER matrix. And the Joint Commission, and we tend to agree, draw the line on significance or lower significance versus higher significance right here. And what is that? That's things that are moderate likelihood to harm, that are not isolated. They're a pattern or they're widespread. Anything that are higher, including things that are immediate threat to life, those are the higher significance. And that only amounts to about 25% of the findings on a typical survey report. So 75% of the things that you get on your survey report, it's not that they aren't important, but they're not as likely to lead you into serious trouble. And what do we mean by serious trouble? And by the way, there are so many survey findings related to the physical environment. You know, we don't have data on this, but from our review, and we look at these reports almost on a weekly basis. One of our clients will send us a recent report. Over 50% of the findings have to do with environmental care and physical environment. But LS, they tend to be falling in this 75% of lower significance findings. So why so many? So sometimes leadership says, why is EC and life safety different? Well, one of the reasons it's so frequently cited is just the sheer volume of requirements. I mean, it's just amazing how many different things can go wrong with the physical environment and that are easily surveyed. That's the other thing. Physical environment doesn't move. Patients tend to move and be dynamic. So if you're looking at clinical systems, you tend to look at policies and medical record documentation, and the actual process of care is not that visible to the surveyor, but you know, that building's not going anywhere. And so it's easy to survey. Also, and Steve's going to talk about this earlier, also, we've got some misinterpretations of some of the EC and life safety standards by the clinical surveyors more so than the life safety specialists. Not to say that anybody's perfect, but there tends to be some variation, and they've been asking their clinical surveyors to survey for environmental care and life safety things in the ambulatory environment, the business occupancies. There are some ambulatory settings that still would have a life safety specialist on survey by Joint Commission. And then, of course, that's also a focus of CMS on validation surveys. So let's look at these top two priorities. Why is it important to focus there? Is because these can lead to things such as preliminary denial of accreditation, these follow-up surveys. And by the way, if you get an immediate threat to health or safety, which is a small number but growing, you will receive automatically a preliminary denial of accreditation, which has we won't spend time, but it's not a good thing. And then as far as submitting evidence of standards compliance back to especially the Joint Commission, but really all regulatory agencies, you really need to address leadership and process changes more in depth than you would for the lower significance findings of 75%. So what are these top requirements? And Steve and Lori are going to get into detail, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but we've analyzed the data available for the last 2 years, and we see that suicide was the top one there. The second cluster here is infection prevention. But when you look at what these things are, this has to do really with sterilization and high-level disinfection and the storage thereof. And so that's where you get into temperature, humidity requirements. Those could theoretically go there, but there are some EC standards that are also related to that issue here, especially this one. And so there's a number of infection-related things that fall into the environment of care. And these tend to be more highly cited than the things that don't involve infections in the environment of care. And so that was 2021. 2022 was about the same frequency. But the severity is changing. So that's a couple of years you see the distribution, but how frequently do these things happen? And we've noticed, we've heard anecdotally that the Joint Commission and CMS and the state agencies are finding more and more significant issues as they go through the pandemic. And as we emerge from the pandemic, the number of significant issues, or the proportion of significant issues, is going up. And here's some data to support that. We don't have really complete 2022 data, but from 2021, we see there was about a 1-to-1 relationship between the number of surveys and the number of findings in those top 10. And then as we move on to 2021, we see that the surveys went up a little bit. They went up by about 23% over the previous year. But the number of these high frequency services more than doubled. And so, so we can see that the propensity to find these higher significance findings went up from 2020 to 2021. And also, maybe more significant is that immediate threat to health or safety, this immediate jeopardy type findings just went astronomical. They were very rare in 2020, 2021, not rare at all. I mean, they're still not common, but they increased almost by 6-fold. And from what we hear, and we're in constant contact with the Joint Commission, 2022 was even higher than that and continuing to grow. So paying attention to these high vulnerability things that we're going to get into is very important. And so with that, enough, I think, of theory. I'm sure you're tired of hearing me talk. So I'm really looking forward to the presentation myself. I always learn stuff from Steve and Lori. And so I'm going to give it over to Steve here so he can really talk about what we're experiencing in 2023 and what we can expect as far as environment of care, life safety going forward. So Steve.
Well, thank you very much, Bud, and thanks to everybody out there in the listening and viewing. Now it's a viewing audience, so you get to see our divine countenances. So what to expect in 2023 and beyond? Because clearly, I mean, the shift to the survey of the physical environment has been coming for a long time. And, you know, it's one of those waves that you hope will eventually break. And I'm hoping that it will, and we'll all kind of have some smooth sailing for a bit. But right now that they're showing no indication that the focus on the physical environment is going away anytime soon. And to the point that they're expanding where they're looking and how deeply, you will, or how in depth they are looking. So certainly there's the enhanced emphasis on the ambulatory care environment. That was kind of poised to kick off in 2020. And it's interesting because they did a fair number of surveys in 2020 and 2021 during the pandemic, but it's the number of findings that are really coming into play. That is, I won't call it a concern necessarily, but that's the challenge for the folks who manage the physical environment. We'll be talking a little bit more about who that is in a bit. But there's definitely more life safety specialist time. I think they've learned a lot, because basically they started, I want to say it was back in the late 2000s when they started the Life Safety Surveyor program. They've learned a lot about what it takes to conduct a survey of a building, and they are dedicating, and increasing the dedication of resources to that task. As I like to say, the physical environment is not merely square footage, it's cubic footage. And there's a lot of stuff above and below the ceiling that can be looked at and thus cited. As I like to say to folks, there are no perfect buildings, and they're never more perfect than the moment before you let people in. After that, the challenge becomes, how do we manage all those moving parts, including the people? I was going to say, to Bud's point, the patient care tends to be more dynamic, but the building doesn't go anywhere, but the people who are in the building go everywhere. And that becomes a challenge. The other piece of this relative to the ambulatory care environment is that the clinical surveyors, as we know here, they're expected to review the environment of care and life safety code requirements for business occupancies. All this stuff is always subject to interpretation. So if you've got someone who has we'll call it an incorrect impression, a lot of times it becomes, the challenge in the moment of survey is either walking them back from an overinterpretation or walking them back from an instance where they've asked a question of the staff in the area that may be information that they do not possess. I recently had some information about a survey where the clinical surveyor was asking the staff which of the lights was on emergency power, or actually, no, which of the lights were battery powered lights. And of course, in this particular instance, the entire building was on emergency power and they didn't have any battery powered lights. But the question becomes, what does staff in the field need to know beyond knowing who to call when they have a question for which they don't know the answer? So again, ambulatory care is going to be a big focus, and it's going to be a big vulnerability, because the expectation is that we're managing those care environments to the same degree that we're managing the main hospital. Workplace violence, it's another one. I was going to say the Joint Commission has kind of drawn a line in the sand. Right now, the only standards-based expectation is that we are doing an annual worksite analysis. And so clearly, we've gone through a year of having that standard in place. So having a work product to that end is going to be a key document for their review during the survey. We've been waiting for this next one for a really long time. The end of the public health emergency, which is due to occur on May 11th. Everybody who's working in healthcare, which means everybody within the sound of my voice in this moment, knows that while the public health emergency may officially be over, the impact of COVID and many other things will linger for quite some time. a couple of important things based on the CMS notification that came out a few weeks ago is that they specifically called out the requirements related to temporary petitions between patients. I was going to say the waiver for that process is not going to be in effect any longer. And the waivers associated with hand sanitizer are no longer going to be in effect. So we'll have 60 days after the suspension of the public health emergency to come into compliance. The temporary petitions thing, I think we're probably doing okay in that regard. Due diligence is definitely in order, just to go back and make sure that everything that we have constructed, and that maybe we had to cut the corners a little bit in order to respond to the pandemic, but to make sure that we're using proper materials. I think the bigger issue is going to be with the hand sanitizers, because I've seen in my practice that a lot of hand sanitizer dispensers went up over the last couple of years. And in some instances, we may have more installed in areas where they will no longer be allowed. So I think that's an important piece. Then, of course, there's the lingering impact of the Great Resignation. Folks have left. Staffing is difficult, and it's difficult to bring new folks on. We have budget shortfalls, and then what has resulted in is a lack of emphasis on the fundamentals. As I like to say to folks, we've been moving straight forward at 1,000,000 miles an hour over the last 3 years. And when you're moving a million miles an hour in one direction, the edges tend to get really blurry. And I believe that that's where they're going to focus a lot of their resources when it comes to the survey process. So what are those Common Joint Commission findings? Well, fortunately, that's information that we can look at. Relative to the environment, the immediate threat findings are many and varied. A lot of them have a tendency to deal with sterilization and disinfection, food handling and storage, and then the euphemistic widespread housekeeping and maintenance issues. I was going to say, again, it kind of goes back to that whole concept of people being in the space. Stuff gets broken, stuff gets damaged. You need to have a reliable process in place to repair, replace, et cetera, in order to ensure that the integrity of surfaces is maintained. Because if you have a broken down surface, then the question becomes, well, how are you able to properly disinfect that? Issues with known defects in critical systems, and I will roll emergency power supply into that. When you have testing vendors in the building, pay really close attention to the results of their inspection, testing, and maintenance activities. If they're identifying things as failures, you need to have a process in place for correcting them, and potentially developing an interim strategy for managing the risks associated with those failures until something gets fixed. And again, emergency power supply system testing still shows up more frequently than I feel comfortable at this point. But I think a lot of it has to do with going back to the shortage of staffing, folks having to cover other things, and perhaps not being as familiar with the process as they would want to be, as you would want them to be. So we need to make sure that we're using competent folks, especially when it comes to the inspection, testing, and maintenance of critical systems. So, we've got the laundry list of things that can happen. So, ligature resistance on locked psychiatric units. The Joint Commission has a lot to say about that. I was going to say that there are more than 30 FAQs on the Joint Commission's website regarding the NPS, National Patient Safety Goal 15, and the environmental risk assessment. I think the key piece to keep in mind is that you want your assessments to be comprehensive and thorough. I will say I've seen a few survey results so far this year in which which folks were cited because they did not clearly indicate a risk on their risk assessment. It could be a risk that they've already mitigated, but since they didn't list it on the risk assessment, they were cited. I think the best strategy is to identify everything as a risk and then kind of back off from there. The other piece of this that I think is helpful is, bring folks in who aren't as accustomed to the environment. So it's that whole notion of a pair of fresh eyes. Again, I suppose it's a corollary of the 1,000,000 miles an hour going straight forward, is that when you're in the environment every day, the stuff that might be a little bit squishy becomes invisible over time. So you bring somebody in to look at it new, and they say, well, what about X? Or what about Y? What about that hand sanitizer? It looks like it's not going to be helpful. It looks like somebody could throw a ligature over that. It's the things like that, because you want to identify as much as possible. Because once you've identified it, it's easy to, it's simple and straightforward to manage. It might not always be easy, but that's the dynamic that we're working with. And again, also the other areas where we have behavioral health patients, EDs. We may have outpatient clinics where behavioral health patients receive care. You want to be able to account for those other areas as a function of ligature risk. You don't have to make them ligature resistant necessarily, but we need to make sure that we've identified the risks and that the folks in the spaces know how to manage those risks appropriately, because we don't want patients to be in a position where they can harm themselves. Room sweep tools or checklists used by nursing to mitigate hazards is a great way to go with that, but you have to make sure that those room sweep tools or checklists are sufficiently comprehensive. Because again, if you don't identify the risk, it makes it much more challenging to manage it on an ongoing basis and to be able to convince a surveyor that you're doing that. Let's see, so where do we go next?
Yeah, I just wanted to make one comment here, Steve.
Sure.
I just want to emphasize that we see this on almost every report. So this is still a challenge for people. So we want to emphasize that.
Okay, thank you. So moving on, one of the interesting, or at least interesting to me, things over the last 3 years is that we made our buildings do things that they were never designed to do. We made spaces negative that were never designed to be, under negative pressure, et cetera, et cetera. We've maxed out oxygen supply systems. I was doing some client work this week, and we were talking about the size of the oxygen lines and how that impacted our abilities over time. Temperature, humidity, and airflow are always going to be part of an equation, because this is probably the most critical instance of where the physical environment and infection control kind of meet up, particularly in procedural areas. Again, EP15 deals with what the Joint Commission euphemistically refers to as locations designed to control airborne contaminants. So it's isolation rooms, it's sterile processing areas and sterile storage locations, it's ORs, it's cath labs, it's the whole thing. And again, depending on the complexity of our buildings and the mechanical system, and then you put people in them, and they open doors and they close other doors that they're not supposed to, or they tape over a duct because they're cold. This is a constant battle, if you will, for supremacy. The piece of it becomes, you have to determine because a lot of times the question comes up is, well, how often do we have to look? And my half tongue-in-cheek response is always, well, you have to do it often enough to be able to ensure reliability. If you have a building automation system that measures temperature and humidity, and actually there are some building automation systems that that monitor airflow as well, then you have the ability to constantly monitor this. For folks in older facilities, that is a taller order, and more likely it's going to involve some sort of logging system. I was going to say the other corollary is if you're doing a daily log, I was going to say you want to try to pick the time where you have the greatest likelihood of success. But you need to be able to have the conversation with the folks who occupy the environment to make sure that they're managing it in the way you think they are. I can't tell you how many times I've run into instances when doors have been propped open and air pressure relationships aren't what they need to be. And I know that folks know how to behave during the survey. When Elvis is in the building, everybody recognizes that they have to be on their best behavior. But the thing of it is, temperature, humidity, and airflow should be in the mix every day because we're doing surgical procedures, et cetera, et cetera. So if people are kind of dancing on the edge of things on a regular basis, then they're putting people at risk, and that is not a good thing. Next up, safe and suitable environment. So this has become, ECO 20601 has become the general duty clause, if you will. A couple of years ago, a lot of the ligature risk stuff ended up here, and I suspect that it still does every once in a while, though it really should be under NPSG 15. To the point, almost anything the surveyor does not like ends up here. So issues with stained ceiling tiles, the maintenance of furnishings, rips, tears, damaged surfaces. I was going to say, because not everybody can afford to have solid surfaces in all their areas. Formica breaks, people they run beds into it, or they run beds into doors, and the doors damage the wall behind them. It's the people. It's the people that make it happen. So again, the question becomes having a reliable process for managing the fixes. We got to get stuff fixed. Labeling of utility systems controls. Mostly this is breaker panels and making sure that the circuit breakers are in the same position that they're indicated on the panel schedules. There's relief coming on that. I was going to say, hopefully the next time CMS changes the adopted edition of the Life Safety Code, there will be consideration for the management of breakers. More on that to come. Let's see. So making sure that zone valves are labeled according to the folks in the field, in the areas in which they are served, need to know what zone valve is for what. So if they use architectural numbers or architectural terms, that's not useful to them. I was going to say the folks who are out at the point of care, point of service need to know how to identify that stuff. In general, utility systems equipment, again, it's the inspection, testing, and maintenance of that. There are high risk utility systems components, and then there's the infection control piece of it, particularly ice machines. And now we have the water management program to work into the equation. There are more risks in the physical environment than you can shake a stick at. And the utility systems equipment services everywhere. So to the point, there are many, many different things. And the expectation is that we are going to be appropriately managing all the risks associated with the utility systems. So relative to hazardous chemicals, this is about eyewash stations. It's about maintaining them. It's about having them in appropriate locations. It's making sure that they're accessible when they need to be. I would venture to say that a lot of the findings relative to eye wash stations, or at least the ones that I've seen over time, are for eye wash stations that really are not required because there are no caustic or corrosive substances in the mix. You don't want to have them where you don't need them, and you don't want to have them behind a locked door or behind a door. They have to be unobstructed at all times, and the folks who get the stuff in their eyes need to be able to get to them. And yes, squeeze bottles don't count. So
Hey,
keep
Steve,
that in mind. Yes.
Can you just clarify a little bit about the caustic corrosive versus not? Because a lot of times, you know, the people put bleach in a solution. Is that caustic or how do they find out whether it's caustic or corrosive and would require an eye wash station?
The best, check the product label, because sometimes the product label will tell you. But the be all end all is the safety data sheet for the product. It will tell you whether it's caustic or corrosive or injurious. If it's caustic or corrosive, then, and it's specific to that, because since they modified the safety data sheet format, all of them say you need to have an eye wash station, but OSHA requires them only if you have caustic or corrosive chemicals. And so you want to have the conversation where the safety data sheet is. There are certainly some things that labs, eye wash stations, absolutely. If you're mixing chemotherapy drugs, eye wash station, absolutely. Blood and body fluids, you don't have to have an eye wash station. So I think that's, again, it's always part of a risk assessment. Oh, did we skip? Okay. Moving on to compressed gas cylinders. I don't want to steal all Lori's thunder. We know the deal with compressed gas cylinders. I will say that one thing that has come back as a result of COVID, and it kind of goes back to losing track of the fundamentals, is this year I've seen more unsecured compressed gas cylinders out in the field than I have in a very long time. We had kind of set that one aside, so we've gone back a little bit in that. It's making sure that empty and non-empty cylinders are segregated. It's making sure that in most instances we don't have more than 12 cylinders. Again, there are always exceptions to that, but for the most part. Where this can get really funky is out in the business occupancies if you got them, because the clinical surveyors, they've been given very specific information, but not so much as to how to interpret that information. So folks in those areas, if they have to use compressed gas, you need to make sure that they understand how to do that safely. Okay. Inner life safety measures. So I think this is another one of those fundamentals that has languished a bit during COVID. I think we made a lot of modifications to facilities. I think we probably impacted egress, and we weren't necessarily focusing on ensuring that we have interim life safety measure assessments for those instances. Clearly, this is hardwired into the survey process, because if you have any life safety code deficiencies identified during the survey that you cannot correct immediately, the surveyor is going to walk you through that process. But I would encourage you, for construction projects or any renovation project, to have an interim life safety measures assessment in your back pocket to ensure that if a surveyor disagrees with because you don't get credit for doing the math in your head. You have to be, it's like being in grade school. You have to show your work on the board. So if you have the assessment, they're not supposed to disagree with the results as long as you've done the assessment. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to my delightful colleague, Lori Denny, who's going to talk about some of the life safety code deficiencies that you need to worry about as you're doing all this.
And Steve, before we go to Lori, I just wanted to emphasize, though, it's not just construction. There's a lot of existing life safety code deficits, like if a lot of places have gurneys in the hallways or other things like that, that you need to consider interim life safety measures, not just for construction. It's also existing conditions that you
correct.
Find that you can't.
any life safety code deficiency, and that's any, regardless of its nature, that you cannot immediately correct, the Joint Commission standard calls for a risk assessment.
Right.
You got it.
Sorry to step on your time there, Lori. So let's.
That's okay, Bud. Thank you, Steve. Appreciate it. Hi, everyone. So one of the common findings for LS is 020134, EP09, which only applies to rooms with smoke detection, where we're maybe missing ceiling tiles or they're damaged. The majority of these observations have been in telecom or IT rooms. And as we know, besides missing and damaged tiles, we tend to have a lot of holes in the ceiling tiles as well. Anything that would be cited under, sorry, trying to get something off my screen. Anything that would be other than smoke detection would be under LS 020135 EP14, where the hospital meets all other life safety code automatic extinguishing requirements. That would be, again, where you have missing or damaged ceiling tiles or holes in the ceiling tiles due to penetrations or anything else, in rooms with sprinklers, where the smoke could get through there and prevent the sprinklers from activating. LS 020135, we have EP04, 05, 06, and 14 that I just mentioned. Know the 18-inch rule. So I'm sure everybody out there is familiar with that. But what you need to know is that it's not from the ceiling to the top of the storage, it's from the sprinkler deflector. So if it's a pendant head dropping down from the ceiling tile, it would be from the deflector, not from the ceiling. Dusty sprinkler heads, we know what's going to happen. We have to watch out for that. Work order process, we want to make sure that we have one that functions correctly. Frontline training, credible follow-up. Again, we want to make sure that staff is using it adequately, and also that facilities is following up. We want to have an above the ceiling work permit process, a partnership with IT. All of these things will help with any penetrations through the ceiling tiles and so forth. Okay, fire rated doors, LS 0201-10. So we want to make sure that they have positive latching, that they have closing devices. We want to make sure there are no door stops. We're looking at 1/8 of an inch or less between door pairs. Keep in mind that's for wooden doors. You're permitted up to 3/16 of an inch for metal doors, and then 3/4 inch undercuts. Ceiling of penetration is very common. It's a very common problem above the ceiling. What are some options for those facilities that are a little larger that might have some money? You can always contract with a vendor to come possibly twice a year, and then you would be at 100% for the year when the year's over. Another thing is have a permit, some sort of permit process with your vendors. I've heard a lot of instances where it's amazing if you go after them, follow them when they're complete, and find a lot of penetrations are still there and say that you're not going to pay them. It's amazing how much they get completed. So those are some options, but really what you need to do is follow the people afterwards. Hazardous areas, LS 0201.30. Okay, so now we're looking at if we have 1-hour rooms that they're equipped with 45-minute doors with closers. Notice that there's not a requirement for latches on these doors. If they're 45-minute doors, they are required to have latches because it's a rated door. However, if it's an existing hazardous area that's sprinklered and doesn't require a rated door, the door only requires a closer. It would require a latch if it's fronting a corridor. But if you're looking at something like a sterile core in your OR, and the OR is considered a suite, those doors actually are not required to have latches unless they're rated. And we're looking at rooms such as boiler rooms, central laundries, paint shops, repair shops, soil linen rooms, trash collection rooms. And of course, we're also talking about rooms with combustibles more than 50 square feet. And by combustibles, we're talking about paper and plastics and cardboard, things like that. And of course, the roller latches are prohibited on those doors as well. So let me hand it back to Bud to moderate a little bit our strategies for success.
Yeah, thanks, Lori and Steve. Before we go on to that, there's one question we have, and if anybody else has questions about the actual requirements, that may, because there's tons of requirements, you can type them in or you can raise your hand and we'll sort of field those now before we talk a little bit about how to deal with all this stuff. I mean, because it's overwhelming. But Randy Christensen asks, for newly constructed, newly open clinic, ambulatory care, I'm assuming so hospital-sponsored ambulatory care, do we need to have an HVA, hazard vulnerability analysis, conducted? Steve, I think that's more in your wheelhouse.
It is. I saw that. Hey, Randy, how are you? Well, you know what? It's interesting because the strictly speaking, the answer is it depends. If there is a way, and I think to a fair degree, it probably relies more on proximity to the mothership, if you will. If it's close to your main campus, I think you could probably get by with having the HVA for the main campus extend over, because you look at the risks involved and what the backups are, et cetera, and if the risks are similar, or if they're shared backup systems, et cetera, I think you could get by with doing that as an addendum. But if it's a new facility 10 miles away, I think you would be hard pressed not to have an HVA specific to that, and that would be the same for any type of risk assessment. If the risks are same, and the response requirements are same, then folding it into something existing certainly makes sense. But if it is an outlier, is it worth? I guess actually you can only determine whether it's an outlier by doing an HVA. So you're going to have to do an assessment.
Yeah, well, I mean, bottom line is you do have to have an HVA. But the question is, can you use the HVA that applies to the main campus, or do you need to do a separate one? And my experience, and correct me if I'm wrong in this, Steve, I would just use the one that you use for the main campus and then modify it if you don't have those hazards, or if they would score out differently.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So any other questions, just go ahead and do that. And as we talk, so guys, Lori and Steve, look, this is huge. I mean, we just touched the surface. We did touch the most frequently cited issues, and especially those we touched on are those that are really likely to lead to serious problems. But, how do we get our arms around this? The facilities department can't do all of this. The safety officer can't do all this. The compliance department can't do all of this. It's everybody's job, just like infection prevention is everybody's job with a small, so is environment of care, even non-related. So what we've sort of looked at, and I'd like us to discuss a little bit more completely, is what's necessary. Well, because the compliance department, or the quality department, or the infection control department, or facilities and safety, they don't have any authority over line management. We need the sponsorship, education, and support of the executive level, with, of course, facilities engineering and infection prevention taking the lead as subject matter experts, but they can't be responsible. So and in order to, so that's important. Also, we need to make sure that the rounding we're doing is not whack-a-mole. It needs to be focused. We would say, if you're doing environmental rounding, focus on these, don't have 20 things, have 5 things or 6 things that you really want to make sure that you're fixing. And then once they're fixed and sustainable, move on to something else. That's sort of a concept that we've come up with, and seems to work, because we do, we get engaged when people need to truly sustainably fix these kinds of things. And finally, in order to get the folks at the point of care and service to trust you, there has to be a culture of services. There needs to be a partnership, not a gotcha. There needs to be a credible work order process, or people will not submit work orders unless there's a follow-up to those work orders in a timely way, and quick turnaround time. And your customer really is that frontline associate. So those are some high level thoughts. Lori, Steve, you know, how does this resonate to you? What does this mean practically?
Okay,
Well,
I'll go. Okay, after you, Lori.
Sorry, Steve.
That's okay.
I just wanted to bring up, just last week, I was at a facility where, you know, Bud was talking about the culture of service, and the person walking around with me, we went into one department where the head nurse stopped the person I was with and asked about something that needed to be fixed. And the person I was with asked, "Did you put in a work order?" And she said, "No." And of course, my response as we were walking away was, I looked at him and said, "What did she think? You were going to figure it out by osmosis?" So that's why when we're talking about everyone needs to be involved and we need to train the people, not be a gotcha, that we have to look at that. And so that's just something that I wanted to put out there. Go ahead, Steve.
Okay. Well, as a corollary, because the other thing is, and I'm sure that it may have only happened once during your walk around, but I've been in instances when a dozen folks have come up over the course of a couple hours to say, "Oh, can you do this? Can you do that?" And it's like, so I would be hard pressed to remember everything that everyone had asked me to do. It's like, that's why the work order system, I'm a big fan of memorialization. How do you memorialize that? The work order system is an excellent way to have a record that the notification was made. And again, to the point of having, you know, you have to have an effective system in place, otherwise it doesn't work and people don't trust it. If I may be philosophical for a moment, and I apologize to the folks with whom I have worked over the years. I know there are a few of you out there because you've heard this before, as have any number of my colleagues. My philosophy is there are two kinds of people who work in healthcare. There are finders and there are fixers. Most organizations have a very limited number of fixers. So it becomes the responsibility of everybody else to be a finder, or perhaps finder reporter. I may have to modify, but finders and fixers sounds so good. But if the fixers have to go out and look for stuff to fix, that's incredibly inefficient. In most organizations, the patients, first, certainly patient care spaces, they're occupied 24/7. Walls don't, you know, a hole in a wall doesn't happen when nobody's there. It just doesn't go whoop. So somebody has to witness it. Maybe they didn't do it, you know, because you have to get into that whole thing. You can't be blaming people. But when stuff gets broken, when stuff gets damaged, et cetera, somebody's usually there for it. The example I like to use is the portable X-ray machine that hits the elevator door. It's like, you don't hit the elevator door and break it without knowing it. So it's a question of getting folks, and again, it's, you know, of course, if somebody is busting elevator doors left and right, then that's a different problem. But you want folks to be comfortable to say, you know what, I got a problem over here. You know, it could be EVS saying, you know, the wall is damaged in here, but we've got people moving in and out of all these spaces, and we can capture that information. And it would be very powerful to be able to do that. The organizations that fare the best during the survey process are the ones that make that happen. Again, the environment is a point of care, point of service. It's not on a committee. It's not in anybody's office.
Yeah, and so just in conclusion, because we're almost out of time here, guys, so how do you make that people want to put stuff in? Well, you're not going to be punitive. You need to encourage, you need to follow up on the work orders that are there. There has to be a consistent turnaround time. And if it's going to take a while, the people who reported it need to know, thank you for reporting this. Because when we experience people who are in a lot of trouble, it's the people where the culture has become one of resignation. They say, well, it's all, you know, I can put in a work order, but nothing's going to happen. So they don't put in work orders. So it just takes one or two work orders that aren't responded to timely to really put a chilling effect on that whole process. So listen, I want to thank Steve and Lori profusely for their depth of knowledge and what they're willing to share. Remember, this is just a really quick visit in the subject area. And for more information, you will be given a survey. We'll be glad to follow up with any specific questions. And on behalf of Lori and Steve, I'd like to thank you for your attendance and turn it over to Maria to close us out.
Fantastic. That is all the time that we have for today. And I want to thank Steve MacArthur, Lori Denny, and Bud Bate, and all of you for a lively and informative discussion of this important subject. As we mentioned, the Chartis Clinical Quality Solutions team will follow up with a response to any questions we did not get to during today's Q&A. To learn more about the content presented today, please fill out the post-webinar survey. Thank you for joining us today, and we hope that you have a wonderful afternoon.